Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about literary analysis, a simple way to do it. Literary analysis, simply put, is not just retelling what happens in a story. Instead, it asks us to explain how a writer creates meaning and why that matters to the reader. It's the how and the why. According to literary analysis, then, every strong piece of analysis does three things. It identifies a technique, it uses evidence from the text and explains the interpretation or effect. In short, the formula is what I mentioned on the screen here is the method, technique, evidence, interpretation. So I'm going to explain this method today using two texts, The Watcher and My Mother the Crazy African. They're the two stories that are available as options for your reading analysis. And these stories are useful because they both focus on characters who are watching and interpreting and reacting to the world around them, but they do so in different contexts. So, what is literary analysis? Well, the first thing to understand about it is to know the difference between summary and analysis to draw this distinction. Summary tells us what happens. Analysis explains how the writing works and what reveals it. A strong analytical point names a technique, points to textual evidence, and explains the effect on the reader. Literary analysis also reminds us that evidence does not speak for itself. We have to explain it. So if I say Lynn argues with her mother, that's summary. But if I say Adichie uses first-person narration and language to show Lynn's shame about her identity, which makes the reader feel the pressure of assimilation, that's analysis. I'm no longer just describing events, I'm explaining how the author's choices shape that meaning. So, the first step in this process is to identify a technique, as I mentioned. Now, techniques are things like imagery, literary devices, symbolism, tone, diction, which is the words we choose, characterization, various aspects of characterization, point of view, also known as narrative perspective. It also includes repetition, contrast, structure. There's a lot of ways of talking about techniques. And the more specific you are, the better your analysis becomes. In essence, a technique is what the author does to reveal something in the story. So let's start with The Watcher. One important technique in that story is characterization through narrative perspective, through the point of view. Charlie is presented as someone who's spent much of his childhood observing adults rather than acting. He begins as a passive watcher and is gradually drawn into a world of adult conflict and violence. That makes characterization a useful entry point for analysis, because Charlie is not just a character, he's also the person telling the story, the lens through which the readers understand that moral complexity. Now let's look at My Mother the Crazy African. A key technique there is also first person narration, but here it's combined with the language of identity, diction, the words that the storyteller Lynn chooses. And Lynn narrates this story from her own perspective, of course, and emphasizes her thoughts about accent, naming, cultural belonging, and this reveals her desire to appear American rather than Nigerian. In this case, point of view and diction are central because the story's conflict is not external. She also has conflict with her mother, but it is rather internal within Lynn herself, and the narrative perspective allows the reader to gain access to this. So, next step, guys, after you've chosen a technique or understood a technique that revealed something in the story, we have to choose some evidence that identifies this. And so, once you've identified technique, you select strong evidence that can include key moments, patterns, short quotations, that's the best, descriptions, dialogue, and it shouldn't be too general. Good evidence is relevant, specific, and clearly connected to your point. In The Watcher, evidence for Charlie's characterization include the fact that he begins as a quiet observer shaped by illness and his habit of watching adults, but it later becomes involved in this struggle between Grandma Bailey and Thompson. So this movement from passivity to participation is central to the story, and that arc is evidence because it shows that shift in character. In My Mother the Crazy African, Evidence might include Lynn's objection to her Igbo name, her discomfort with her accent, and also maybe her wish to fit into American teenage culture. The story highlights her resistance to speaking Igbo and her embarrassment about being seen as foreign. Next, guys, after we identify a technique and select some evidence, we interpret the effect. And this is where the analysis really takes shape. The most important part, of course, because interpretation answers questions like, what does this suggest? Why did the writer do this? How does it affect the reader? It even says the question we should ask is, what is the effect of this on the reader? So what is the effect of Charlie's role as an observer and the watcher? One interpretation is that van der Haag uses Charlie's perspective to make readers experience the confusion of growing up, because Charlie watches adult behavior before fully understanding it. Readers are placed in an uneasy position. We see violence, power struggles, moral ambiguity through a mind that's still learning to understand these things. And that deepens the story's themes of innocence. So what about My Mother, the Crazy African now? Well, Adichie's use of first-person narration and language, it invites the reader, I feel, to feel Lynn's divided identity. Because Lynn tells the story herself, we hear the tension between the self she performs in America and the heritage her mother tries to preserve. The effect is that readers do not simply judge Lynn or her mother. Instead, we see how immigration, discrimination, cultural pressure shapes both of them. The story becomes not only a family conflict, but also a story of self-erasure in a way. So, we understand the method now. Let's talk about analytical claims. And here's a useful sentence structure, guys. So, for example, I could say something like, van der Haag, the author, uses characterization through Charlie's limited perspective to show his movement from passive observer to participant, which helps the reader understand how exposure to adult conflict shapes his maturity. Or I could say, Adichie uses first-person narration and diction about names, accents, and language to reveal Lynn's internalized shame, which positions the reader to see assimilation as emotionally costly. Notice that in both examples, I use the same method: technique, evidence, interpretation. And that's how we understand an analytical claim. So now, moving on to building a thesis. Okay, so what's a thesis, guys? Well, we remember from our COM 101 classes that theses should make an arguable claim, something that is not proven by nature. It names a technique, connects it to that meaning, and gives direction to your reading analysis. So a weak thesis would be something like, these stories use characterization. It's too obvious. A strong thesis would sound something different, like, through point of view and characterization, both the watcher and My Mother, the Crazy African explore how identity is shaped by observation and pressure. However, while Charlie's watching pulls him into the adult world, Lynn's self-consciousness pushes her away from her cultural roots. The thesis works because it names a technique, makes a comparative claim in this case, and tells the audience what the analysis will argue. So now we talked about claims, producing a thesis. Let's talk about building an analytical paragraph. So I suggest a 5-paragraph structure, everybody, just like COM 101 and how you wrote essays in the past. It means that you produce a topic sentence that tells the reader what the paragraph is about, and then you produce evidence, explain it, the interpretation that is, and link back to the thesis. So something in your reading analysis, or at least a paragraph that you would produce, may sound something like this. And just to read it, Adichie uses first-person narration to reveal Lynn's conflicted identity, topic sentence. We see this in Lynn's repeated concern with her name, accent, and how others perceive her as Nigerian rather than fully American. Evidence. These details show that language is more than communication in the story. It is a marker of belonging and difference. Explanation. As a result, the reader understands that Lynn's rejection of her heritage is not simple rebellion, but a response to social pressure and cultural insecurity. interpretation. So, this paragraph works. It explains what the conflict means, and this is literary analysis. Now, just quickly, everybody, before I finish, I want to mention a few common mistakes to avoid, okay? First, don't retell the entire plot. It's not summary. I've read the story. You are telling me about the effects on the reader through techniques and evidence. Second, don't name a technique without explaining it, all right? This is just like using evidence in an essay. You need to tell the reader why you selected that evidence. And third, don't drop in evidence and expect it to do the work for you. Okay. And finally, avoid vague comments like "this is interesting," "this makes the story better." These things, these comments that really have no specific details to it. Instead, try to be precise. Explain what you understand about the effects you read, what you feel, what you notice because of the writer's choices. Why do those choices produce a character, an individual, or a certain theme or a relationship? So in both of these texts, a weak response would say that characters have problems, or something like that. A stronger response explains how the author presents those problems and why that presentation matters. And this is what makes analysis analytical. So to conclude, everybody, literary analysis is really about moving from noticing to explaining. And this method here gives us a clear structure. We identify a technique, what the author did, support it with evidence, something from the text, and interpret its effect. Okay? Remember, don't stop at what happens in the story. Ask how the writing creates meaning and what that effect has on the reader. And this is the heart of literary analysis, everyone. Okay? This is the idea of interpretation. This is why we read stories. Remember, the idea is that if I look at a painting, a picture, if I watch a movie, there are things that the director or the painter does where they use a visual medium. I can understand a character because I understand people. I see someone on the screen acting in a way that produces anger or conflict or frustration. When we read stories, all we have are the words on the page. So that's why we identify techniques, how the author produced something. We select evidence that represents it, and then ultimately the analysis comes when we talk about how it made the reader feel. So when you read these stories, everyone, think about how it made you feel. Okay? Good luck, everyone. I'll see you in the discussion boards.